Greetings, folks, and welcome to our fourth lecture. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about verbs, the classes of verbs there are in Old English, and the effect that those classes have on modern English. Mostly, of course, as this is a language history course, not a language course, I'm going to be concerned with making sure you're familiar with the general patterns involved. So as I show you these big charts full of verbs and their principal parts and things like that, don't be alarmed. You don't have to memorize them. You just have to know about them and understand how they're different. What makes a weak verb, what makes a strong verb, what makes an irregular verb, that kind of thing. I also want to begin with a little bit about Old English orthography, that is, the letters that writers in Old English used to represent the sounds of their language. So here basically is the layout of today's talk. Before I get into that, though, I should also just mention that because this week's talks have all been very technical, next week I think I'd like to focus a little more on the historical side of things, on the cultural side of things, and look at more words themselves. Words are really interesting. Not just the classes of words and the kind of words, but the things themselves. Words tell stories. So next week, that's what I have in mind when we talk about the encounter between, for example, the Vikings and the English. But, as I said a moment ago, onward. As you've probably noticed looking through your text, Old English doesn't look the same as modern English. They have some letters that we don't, and they don't have some letters that we do. So I'd like to begin by just addressing those. I think that will help make the language seem a little less alien. The majority of today's talk, though, will be taken up with getting into the three different classes of verb in Old English. Weak verbs, strong verbs, and irregular verbs, how to define them, how they work, and how each group is important for the subsequent development of English. I hope you find it interesting. So, what do we say about the Old English alphabet? For starters, from the time they began writing, they of course used the Roman alphabet. This makes sense historically. The Anglo-Saxons who came from the continent, of course, were illiterate. They had no alphabet. They learned to write from the monks and missionaries who persuaded them to accept Christianity. Now, there were actually two groups of monks involved in the conversion. One group working under the Irish Church, coming out of the monastery on the Isle of Iona off the west coast of Scotland, and another group working from the south under the authority of Rome. These two groups used slightly different alphabets. The Irish used something called the Gothic alphabet, which was very similar to the Roman alphabet, but not identical. For historical reasons that don't really concern us right now, the Roman alphabet ended up being preferred. In any case, as I said, they mostly used the Roman alphabet, but they did not use J, K, Q, V, X, or Z. And their use of G and W was kind of weird. I'll get into that in a minute. So they used 20 Roman letters. I should also add that when we refer to the Roman alphabet as the alphabet that modern English uses, this isn't strictly speaking true. The Romans didn't have a J or a W, so it stands to reason that neither would people who learned to write from them. And the letter V originally stood for both the V sound and the U or W sound. So the V sound and the U and W sounds. It wasn't until the 2nd century or so that different letters started to be used to distinguish those two sounds. The use of K as well, while present in Latin, wasn't entirely common. The early Anglo-Saxon scribes also threw in a few letters of their own, because of course the Roman alphabet is designed for the Latin language, and the sound system of Latin is very different from the sound system of Old English. As for the letters that the early English monastics used, that weren't part of the Roman alphabet, there were 5. One is the vowel ash, which you may remember from the last lecture because this is a character in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Ash stands for the sound a, as in hat, cat, that. The reason they did this is that the a in Old English, very much like the a in German, stands for the ah sound. And the e, of course, stands for or depending on whether it's long or short, so they needed a letter that was intermediary between the A and the E, hence ash. The next two, the thorn and the eth, that's the funny-looking P thing and the funny-looking curly cross D thing, are used to represent, well, were originally used to represent the sounds for which we use the TH. So, th as in thing, and th as in that. Initially, thorn was used for the unvoiced version of that consonant, as you can probably guess by the name, whereas eth, which looks kind of like a D, was used for the voiced version of it. Over time, this usage got confused and it largely became a matter of scribal preference. But initially, there is a very sound logic for using two letters to stand for two distinct sounds. As for the next two, you probably haven't seen these even if you've read Old English, because most editors change them. The first one that looks like a wonky 3 is called a yoch, and it is usually changed in modern editions of Old English to a G. And as I said, the Old English scribes had an irregular use of the G. They tended to use yoch instead, but sometimes there were Gs. Similarly, for the second letter there, it's called win, and when it appears, it always stands for a W, or it always, sorry, it doesn't stand for a W, it does what a W does. It stands for the consonantal W sound. This one won't cause any confusion, because as I said, it only does one job. Now, I should also point out that in Old English, as opposed to modern English, Y is only a vowel. You probably all remember growing up, I remember this from grade 1 a long, long time ago, that the vowels in English are A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes Y. Did you ever wonder why that is? I always wondered why that is. And when I started studying Old English, I finally found out, so now I'm going to tell you. So here's the story. The letter yoch stood for different sounds depending on the letters around it. Specifically, if it was followed by an A, an O, or U, or a Y, it made a G sound. That is the sound we generally associate with a G. Thus we have, for example, the word gos, yoch-os, meaning goose, or the word gar, yoch-ar, meaning spear. It also made a G sound when it was followed by another consonant, any consonant. On the other hand, if it was followed by an E or an I, it made a Y sound. That is the sound we now associate with the consonant Y. So the Old English word year, spelled yoch-e-a-r, becomes the modern English word year. Because in the Middle English period, scribes started differentiating between the two sounds. So we also have the Old English word yerd, yoch-e-a-r-d, which simply becomes in modern English yard. Or the Old English word yellan, yoch-i-e-l-l-a-n, becomes the modern English word yell. And if you want to see it doing both of its jobs, take a look at both ends of the word gradi, greedy. At the beginning, it's making a G sound, and at the end, it's making a Y sound. For some reason, when I learned this, it made me very happy. And while we're on that topic, something else that makes me happy is the letter eth. You've probably never heard anyone say that before. Now you have. Here's why. Take a look at the spellings of two of the characters in the wonderful poem Beowulf. There's Hrothulf and Hrothgar. Now, Hroth in both of those means glory. Ulf means wolf, and Gar, as we already discussed, means spear. Now, the way letters, the way pronunciations changed over the course of the language, words that in Old English began with HR, the hr sound, in modern English simply begin with an R. So the word ring, H-R-I-N-G, is just ring. And the eth, the th sound, tended to become a D in certain circumstances. So, the name Hrothulf, meaning glory wolf, simply becomes Rudolph, as in the red-nosed reindeer. Whereas Hrothgar, on the other hand, and you can probably see this coming now, becomes my name. Yes, I have the same name as the King of the Danes in Beowulf. If you wish, you may henceforth direct all correspondence in this course to Your Majesty. But we're not here to talk about me. We're really here to talk about verbs, and we really should get around to doing that. Before we start talking about verbs, though, and specifically Old English verbs, we need to get some technical terminology out in the open. The first thing is principal parts. The principal parts are the forms of a verb that are taken as the basic forms. Typically in English, the three principal parts of a verb will be the present tense, the past tense, and the past participle. Sometimes the infinitive, so to with the base form of the verb following it, will be included, but as the present tense uses the base form of the verb, we don't tend to worry about that. So in the case of the verb to sing, the principal parts are sing, sang, sung. Now, present tense and past tense are pretty straightforward. You might not know what a past participle is, so here is how it works. The past participle, or the present participle as well for that matter, is an adjective form of the verb. It can't stand on its own as a conjugated verb. If it's functioning as a verb, it needs to have what's called a copula verb along with it, usually some form of to be or to have. So I might say, I sing, I sang, the song was sung. We use the past participle in the passive voice, which Old English didn't have. So okay, those are the principal parts in modern English. In Old English, it's a little bit different, but now that you've got your heads wrapped around how it works in a language you know, we'll shift into a language that's a little less familiar. Now, in Old English, there are four principal parts, and there are always four principal parts. The infinitive, the first and second preterite, and the past participle. We'll take a look at the infinitive first. The infinitive is the root form of the verb with simply what's called an infinitive ending on the end. Now in Old English, the infinitive endings were an and ian. All this means is that the verb is not conjugated. It makes no reference to time. The present tense is not included here simply because the present tenses of the verb are made from the root in the infinitive. Now, what the hell's a preterite? Honestly, for our purposes, preterite is just a fancy word for past tense. The first preterite is the form that the verb takes in the past tense in its singular conjugations, and the second preterite is the form that the verb takes in the past tense in its plural conjugations. That's all. Now, as for the past participle, it does about the same job in Old English as it does in modern English, with the exception of there not being a passive voice. And if you take a look at the ending there, the en, signifying the past participle, that is something that we actually still have. For example, while we no longer use it in sing, and I did use the same word in modern and Old English just for the sake of comparison, but we'll take another word that comes from Old English, take, from takan. That one still maintains the en in the past participle. Its principal parts in modern English are take, took, taken. So there you go. There are the principal parts of the Old English verb. Pretty straightforward, really. The infinitive, the singular past tense, the plural past tense, and the past participle. Great. Let's move on and talk about moods. Well, your first question is probably, what is a mood where verbs are concerned? And the answer is pretty straightforward. A mood indicates something called modality. That is the way in which a verb is being used. And in Old English and in other Indo-European languages, there are three: the indicative, the subjunctive, and the imperative. The indicative is what we use when we're making a statement or asking a question, when we're saying something that is either assumed in context to be true or to be represented as true, for example, if we're telling a lie or writing fiction, or when we're asking a question because we want to find out what is true. This is the mood we use most of the time. The subjunctive is one that we don't use all that much in modern English anymore. In Old English, they used it a lot. In modern English, it's largely fallen out of use, and its function has been taken over by what are called modal verbs. can, could, would, might, may. We'll talk about these in a couple of weeks. But what the subjunctive does is it refers to something that is understood in context to be unreal, so a hypothetical, or something you wish or hope for, or fear. Finally, there's the imperative, and that is simply the mood of command. Let's take a look at some examples in modern English. So I might say in the indicative, I am speaking. That's simply a statement of fact. Then I might choose to offer some advice. If I were you, I would listen. Now you can see how that is unreal, can't you? I am not you. So I'm stating a condition that is definitively unreal. And notice the form of the verb there. I'm using were rather than was. So the verb looks different in the subjunctive than in the indicative. Or I could be a little less polite and simply say, be quiet, listen. There's the command right there. That's the imperative. Or we could put it into a straightforward conversation. The employee says, I can't come to work tomorrow. That's in the indicative. It's stating a fact. Then the boss replies, be that as it may, your report is due by noon. Email it to me. And that covers all three moods. Be that as it may is a hypothetical. Your report is due by noon is simply a fact, and email it to me is an instruction, a command. Now, as I said, in modern English, we don't use the subjunctive constructions all that much anymore. Largely, it tends to survive in fossilized expressions, such as be that as it may. Or I might say something like, be you rich or be you poor, you still have to pay your taxes. Or I might say, were I single, I would probably be living in Asia right now. And that's it. Those are the moods. Now, I don't want to sound too cocky here because Old English fully conjugated the indicative and also fully conjugated the subjunctive differently. So that's fun. In any case, I think we should now talk about the different types of verb. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, there are three types of verb in Old English: weak, strong, and irregular. The weak verbs and strong verbs are largely differentiated by what the root vowel does as the verb is conjugated as it moves through its principal parts. The irregulars are their own beast, of course, but there aren't that many of them. Seriously, there are only 4. Let's keep it simple and start with the weak verbs. So let's begin with some definitions. As I said, weak and strong verbs are largely differentiated by the behavior of the vowel. In the weak verbs, the root vowel doesn't tend to change across forms. That is, it's fairly consistent in all the principal parts and in all of the conjugations. Generally, its infinitive is in IAN, that is, ian, rather than the an, an, which tends to indicate strong verbs. This, by the way, goes back to Proto-Germanic. It's not unique to Old English. The past tense and past participle, respectively, are indicated by a suffix, od in the case of the past tense, and ode in the case of the past participle. This is where we get our ed endings for the past tense and past participles in most of our verbs in modern English. That is, most of our verbs are, or are patterned off of, weak verbs. These are the simplest type, and because they're the simplest type, that is, the vowel is consistent, you just add the right suffix and you've got the right verb. When English imports verbs from other languages, and most of the English verbs now, by the way, are imported, they tend to become weak. We have very few imported verbs that actually become strong. I think we've got a couple that tend to be strong by analogy, but the vast majority are weak. Strive, for example. We actually get that one from Old French, but it's not treated as a weak verb, it's treated as a strong verb. Strive, strove, striven. That is, it seems to have fallen into the class 1 strong verbs, which I will be explaining to you in just a few minutes. But let's take a look at an example. It'll make more sense when you see it. So let's take a look at the verb hieran, to hear, which is of course where we get our word hear. The indicative looks like this. In the first person, it's just ich hiere, thu hierst, heo hiert, and in the past tense, ich hierde, thu hierdest, hyrde. Whereas in the plurals, and I'll just do the first person because they're all the same, we hyrath in the present, or we hyrden in the past. And you can see, just looking at that, the roots of how we actually make most of our verbs, can't you? Especially if you think of just a slightly archaic version of modern English. So while in Old English I'd say ich höre, in modern English I say I hear. Not much difference. And while in the second person I would say du hörst, in a slightly archaic version of modern English I'd simply say thou hearest. And her heareth, in slightly archaic modern English, simply becomes she heareth. So really the only part of that one that is any particular challenge at all is whether or not the verb itself has survived into modern English. And as I said, most of our current verbs don't come from Old English. In fact, only about 1% of the modern English lexicon does come from Old English, which leaves us lots to talk about for the rest of the term. When we move to the subjunctive, it simplifies a bit, of course, because all of the singulars look the same. But you will notice some differences. Take a look at the plural. The plural ending in the subjunctive is an, rather than ath in the present or on in the past, as with the indicative. The imperative is straightforward. The imperative is only ever in the second person. It only ever can be, because it's a command. You're speaking directly to someone. So it, of course, doesn't need a noun or a pronoun to indicate the subject. So whereas in modern English I might say hear me, in Old English I'd say hear me. Or, if I'm speaking to more than one person, I'd say heareth me. But that is very straightforward, I think. The only other parts of this I think I need to draw your attention to are the present participle, whereas in modern English we use ing, ing. In Old English they use end or ende. This is actually similar to the present participle in French, incidentally. So hierende simply means hearing. And in the past participle, and this is something that Old English preserves from Proto-Germanic and that a number of other Germanic languages still do, this part of speech was often, actually usually indicated in addition to any change in the root verb by adding the prefix y. So rather than heared, it's yeheared. Now sometimes, and we'll talk about this next week, the past participle took on a specialized meaning of the verb and became a verb in itself. Because of course language is always changing and adapting to the speech patterns of whoever happens to be using it. Ultimately, always, the speech community is the final authority on what a language is, not the dictionary. And as I was recording that last bit, it also occurred to me that sometimes the past participle could become a noun, and sometimes, I believe, an adjective. Because language is fun. But that's the weak verbs. Time to move on to the strong verbs, and they are a little more involved. As I mentioned before, the principal defining factor of a strong verb is that the root vowel changes across the forms, across the principal parts. So basically, that's the difference between a strong and a weak verb. When we're speaking of Old English, the difference between strong and weak, whether it's verbs or other things, always indicates how much work the root word does, how much work the root form does, whether it transforms to indicate its function or whether it requires something external, be it a suffix or, with the weak nouns, as we saw last lecture, a demonstrative or some other indicator. In any case, that's the most important element of the strong verbs. Their infinitives were always in an. Now, you probably noticed that hieran, a weak verb, is also in an. Most of them are in ian. So basically it's like this. If a verb's infinitive is in ian, it is always weak. If it's in an, it's probably strong, but you'll need to look for some other indicators. Past tense and past participle of strong verbs are also different. You'll remember that with the weak verbs, it was od or ode. With the strong verbs, it's on or en. I don't think we still have any remnants of on in modern English, but we do have a number of past participles in en. All of these were strong verbs in Old English, with the exception of striven, and that really is the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. And to make it really fun, there are actually 7 classes of strong verb in Old English, and kind of 7.5 because class 7 has an A and a B. And because I know you're curious, here they are. Now, at first glance, this table, on which we'll probably be spending more time than on any other slide in this lecture, might look a little intimidating. But it's actually not that complicated. For one thing, most of the words that appear here are words that we still have in modern English, so there's something that you can definitely relate them to. And on the other, once they're arranged this way, the logic behind the forms is actually fairly clear. And really, I think when you look at these, more than anything else that we've done in this lecture so far, you can start getting a sense, or you can get more of a sense, of where some of the words we use come from and what kind of stories lie behind them. Let's take a look at class 1. In the infinitive shinan, simply means to shine. This is where we get our word to shine. In the first preterite, so singular past tense, is shone, which is simply shone. It's pronounced the same way, so it looks very different, but it's not all that different at all. And in the second preterite, so the plural past tense, shinan. Now notice here, the root verb doesn't change, but it does have that on suffix to indicate the past tense. Whereas in the past participle, shinen, again, the root verb doesn't change, but it has the n suffix to indicate the past participle. These are the simplest of the strong verbs, I think, because across the principal parts, the only place where the vowel changes is in the first preterite, in the singular past tense. And what their indicators are, that is, the things that identify them as such if you're reading, is that the root syllable has the vowel long I, E, followed by one consonant. That's it. Now, if we move down to class 2, it gets a little more complicated. So our example here is kreop. And I realize as I'm looking at this slide, and it's too late to fix because I need to post these soon, I should have written kreopan. I will fix that before I put up the PowerPoint. This is simply our verb to creep. Now, if we take that across the other principal parts, it becomes in the first preterite, so the singular past tense, kreap. If I were to say, ich kreap, this would be translated in modern English into I crept. So we still, in modern English, maintain a change in the vowel for this one, don't we? In the second preterite, so the plural past, krupan. We obviously don't keep this. If I say we krupan, we crept. In the past participle, it's a different vowel still, kropen. So we have, across the 4 principal parts, 4 distinct vowels. And the indicator here is a root vowel of the diphthong eo, followed by one consonant. Once you memorize these, they're not that tough. Of course, again, this is not a language course, and I'm not going to make you memorize them, but having a sense of how these paradigms work will give you a sense of where a lot of our verbs come from and why some of our verbs look different from other ones. Now, another example of class 2 is the verb brukan, meaning to enjoy. Now, we still have that word in kind of an archaic sense, but it doesn't mean enjoy anymore. If I say something like, I will brook no refusal, which is archaic but still comprehensible, I'm using a descendant of that verb brukan, only now it's taken on the meaning of something like tolerate. So words don't just change form over time, they also change meaning in some really interesting ways. Again, I think I'm going to address that with you in a really concrete sense next week. And across the other principal parts, We would say break, brukan, or broken. These are also class 2, because even though the root vowel in the infinitive is different, an u, a pure vowel, rather than the diphthong eo, the vowels in all of the principal parts are the same, and the vowel is always followed by a single consonant. Okay, moving on to class 3, braidan, to pull. This is where we get our word braid, as in to braid one's hair. And across the principal part, this is braidan, braid, brogdon, and brogden. So again, in each part, there's a different vowel. But notice also the difference in the G, which of course would have been a yoch in Old English. Where the yoch follows an I or an E, it makes an E sound. So we have braidan and braid, but brogdon and brogden. As for class 4, our example is beran, which simply means to bear. So, running across the principal parts here, we have beran, bear, baron, and boren. And this one is defined by an E followed by one consonant, which will usually be an R or an L. Now, you'll remember from last week that the R's and L's are liquids. These are closely related, so there is an underlying logic there as well. For class 5, our example is tredan, to tread. These are very similar to class 4 with the exception of the past participle. So running across the principal parts, tredan, trad, tradon, and treden. These ones also have a root vowel of E followed by one consonant, usually a stop or a spirant. Moving on to class 6, faran, meaning to fare or to go, so fare thee well. And across its principal parts, it's faran, foron, faran. And it's defined by A followed by one consonant. In class 7a, our example is heldan, hold, which across the principal parts are heldan, held, heldon, and helden. Whereas in 7b, hatan, command, is hatan, het, heton, haten. Now with these, the vowel in the infinitive and past participle is usually the same. And in both preterites, that is the singular past tense and the plural past tense, it also tends to be the same. And you can see looking at this chart that again, these words may look a little bit alien, but once you understand the transformations through which they go, and also once you understand the differences in orthography, they're not as different as they seem. As for the strong verbs in modern English, we have several. We tend in modern English to call our survivals of strong verbs irregular verbs because there are so few of them left. I think about 56 or something like that, that the classes to which they belong are no longer readily apparent to pretty much anyone but someone who studied Old English or to a linguist. So they seem just weird. They seem irregular. But they're not truly irregular. There is a logic behind them, and the logic behind them can always be traced back to which class of strong verb they belong to. That is, all of the strong verbs in modern English, with the exception of strive, used to be strong verbs in Old English, as I've said. But they're not technically irregulars. The irregulars go something like this. Now, as for the irregulars, these ones don't follow an identifiable pattern in the ways that the strong verbs do. And often they are actually conflations of two different verbs, and maybe even three, whose histories may go back past Proto-Germanic and right into Proto-Indo-European. That is, they're often words that have just come together, very common words, who probably because they're so common and used in so many different circumstances, have evolved a unique pattern. The four irregular verbs in Old English are beon, to be, willan, to intend, don, to do, and gan, to go. We'll take a quick look at each of these, and then I will convert the lecture to an MP4 and get it up on the page as quickly as I can. So to start with our most basic verb, beon, this one's a conflation of 3 distinct verbs and has 2 present tense roots. So in the first person, we can say ich eum thu ert, he is, or we sind or we sinden. Or we can say ich beo thu bist, he bith, we beoth. Whereas in the past tense, we would say ich was thu were, he was, we weron. And here you can see the roots of am, are, is, and was and were. So they haven't completely taken on the form that they do in modern English, obviously, but the basics of that irregular verb in modern English are certainly present in the Old English version of it. In the subjunctive, what stands out here is the present in both the singular and the plural, sie and sehen, which modern English doesn't maintain, but German does. And you can see, I think very clearly looking at this one, that 3 distinct words whose meanings must have been very, very close simply gravitated together by common usage. And because their usages were so common, the distinctions between them were lost, so they effectively became one word. But of course, language needs to have a logic, so the different elements coming from the different ancestor words took on different grammatical functions. When we turn to willan, the situation simplifies. This is simply one word, meaning to intend. Etymologically, it's related to the vol element, as in, for example, voluntary, coming out of Latin. It's that towards which one inclines, towards which one actively moves. That's the general sense of it. And while it's a fully inflected verb in Old English, we tend to use it in modern English as a modal verb. So we use will to indicate both intent and future, and we use would from wolde to indicate basically a hypothetical intent, something that we call the unreal conditional. So this one serves a much reduced function in modern English compared to what it did in Old English. The reason for this, which we'll see when we take a look at the consequences of the Norman Conquest, is simply that this function came to be covered by other words largely coming out of French. When we turn to don, again, this one is relatively simple. It doesn't follow the same pattern exactly as either the weak verbs or any of the strong verbs, but it is at least composed of elements of one word that simply evolved along a different trajectory. So this is where we get, for example, our word did, as in ich dide. Its irregularities largely involve the vowels, and these tend not to have much of an effect on how it looks in modern English, in this particular case. And finally, we come to gone, to go. This is another weird one because it's a conglomeration of more than one word. So in the present tense, it's ich ga thu gast, heu gath, we gath. And in the subjunctive, ga and gone. The imperative is strictly ga and gath. But in the past tense, it comes from a completely different word, and not the different word that the past tense of go in modern English comes from. So in Old English, it's ich eode, thu eodest, he eode, we eodon. Or in the subjunctive, eode and eodin. All of these eod words have become went in modern English, which itself seems to have come from the Proto-Germanic wendjanan, which also gives us the English word wend, to wind one's way. So still irregular, but irregular in a different kind of way because English is that special. In any case, I'm once again a little late getting this sucker up. I need to get more efficient at doing these because I was up recording until 3:30 in the morning and then up again early this morning trying to get it done. So it's just a learning curve for all of us, isn't it? So I'm going to sync up these recordings with these slides and get this up on the Moodle page as quickly as I can. And I'm thinking also by the end of the day, what I'd like to have up for you folks is both a PDF and a recording of a substantial chunk of Old English poetry. Because, of course, the little bits that you have in your textbook are useful, and I do want to talk about some of those on Friday in our Teams meeting. I want you to have more of a sense of how the language works, not just as specimens, but as a thing itself that actually does something. So I'll have that up before I go to bed tonight. In the meantime, thanks a lot for listening, and I do look forward to seeing you something like face-to-face in a couple of days.